So I just wanted to give my overall breakdown and prediction of the Canelo Crawford fight for September 13th in Las Vegas. You do have a few different shakeups in terms of the date and location, but it seems to be pretty finalized now, even though you don't have an exact venue. But I really would say that everything about this fight has the makings for a great combat sports event, and this is definitely one of the bigger fights in recent years, if not one of the biggest. I would say anytime you have guys that have been in the top 10 pound for pound lists for several years, and both of them being number one on different lists at different times, I would say you have the makeup for a really big and exciting fight, along with them being both pretty popular in the boxing world. And even outside of that, I would say especially Canelo is a lot more of a household name, but Crawford is really up there too. And I think really this is almost being compared to the biggest, or one of the biggest boxing fights in history, probably the biggest pay-per-view fight of all time, of Mayweather and Pacquiao. So I would say that this definitely has the equation to really mimic that in recent years, but I'm not too sure if it would necessarily beat that or come close to that when it's all said and done in terms of the pay-per-view numbers. I'm not too sure if they also have a specific promotion or streaming service that they're looking to use for something like this. I know Netflix was an idea originally, but it doesn't look like they're going to go forward with that. I would say you had that with the Jake Paul and Mike Tyson fight, and there was a lot of different crashings and stuff like that in terms of using that service. So maybe there's just not enough confidence in going that way. But I would say personally, I think a free avenue would really open the door for a lot more publicity for these fights. And I would say that could also open a lot of doors just in terms of getting more eyeballs on this. But again, not too sure how that's going to affect this. But going into the two fighters, you have Canelo, who's now 34, but has a birthday coming up pretty soon. So he'll be 35 going into this fight. And then you have Terrence Crawford, who's 37, soon to be 38. I think his birthday is just a couple weeks after this fight, but both pretty decorated careers in their own right. You have Canelo, who despite being younger actually has a much longer decorated boxing career with more fights total, and really started at a younger age. I believe he started professionally a few years before Crawford did. And Canelo is now the undisputed super middleweight champion, even though he's really gone up in weight, kind of gradually established himself there over the past few years or even decade, where you have Crawford, who's a lot smaller in terms of his overall size. You have Canelo at 168 usually, and Crawford being about usually 20 pounds lighter than that in his fights. But you do have Crawford being a pretty established welterweight, and then going up recently to win the light middleweight title against his fight with Madronov. So if he was able to beat Canelo here, he would become a 3-division undisputed champion. So I think that would obviously make Crawford's win in this instance a lot more impressive, since he is coming up even further to face Canelo here. And even though obviously the experience would go to Canelo in this, you really have to look at Crawford's record at 41-0 in terms of being undefeated, which I would say is definitely something not to take lightly, even though he is the likely underdog here due to the weight difference. But I wouldn't necessarily say that Canelo's losses are a bad thing. I do think Canelo has put himself in several hard tests at different points throughout his career. And really, the loss to Mayweather early in his career, I don't think is that significant for him to take that fight at that point. I think was a great learning experience. And then the loss to Bivol, I think, is a little bit more concerning. But again, since Canelo was really trying to make his way up in weight to see how far he could go, I don't think that loss is as devastating as some losses can be in boxing. And then you also have the 2 draws, one being to Triple G, of course, and then one earlier in his career. So with both of their resumes, I would say that regardless of their big names, that this definitely has the recipe for a really exciting and engaging fight. Even in comparison to Mayweather and Pacquiao, I would likely predict that this has a really good chance of action from either fighter, and I think even though I'm sure there'll be some caution, there's a good chance of activity from both guys. And obviously you do have a chance of a knockout, more from Canelo of course, but I wouldn't write off Crawford here in terms of even having just the chance to land a knockout or a knockdown in this fight, just given the caliber of fighter that he is. And looking at their recent fights, besides the jump up in weight from Crawford, you really just have the Errol Spence Jr. fight. So really not as much activity there from Crawford in recent years. And I would say the Errol Spence Jr. fight, even though that was obviously a big anticipated boxing event in terms of both of them being big undefeated names in a fight that was talked about for a while, I don't really think it lived up to the hype because you obviously had the pretty severe accident that Errol Spence was in before. And I would say that that obviously has to be a factor in that, even though I likely think Crawford probably would have beat him either way. I would say obviously the pretty dominant performance that Crawford had, I don't think he would have been able to be quite as dominant in that. I think there would have been likely a lot more pushback there. But for Canelo recently, you have the William Skull fight about a couple weeks ago in Saudi Arabia, which was a mandatory for Canelo. And then you have a couple other mandatories or challenger fights before that with Berlanga and Munguia, and then the Charlo fight back in 2023. But I wouldn't really say that Canelo has been tested a whole lot since the Dimitri Bivol loss in May of 2022. So it is a little bit hard, I think, to know really where Canelo's at in terms of his skill level, if he's kind of tapered off or if he is just as dominant as he's ever been and really still at the peak of his career. Whereas I would also say that Crawford has usually been pretty consistent, but obviously the weight advantage for Canelo is going to be Crawford's concern in this. And besides just both of their histories or recent histories, I think the pretty clear-cut understanding of how this fight will go is that there isn't enough of a skill gap between Canelo and Crawford to really make up for the weight advantage that Canelo has in this. So that argument obviously gives Canelo the clear favorite edge in this, but really I wouldn't say it's as simple as that. And the odds have Canelo being the pretty majority favorite here, but it's not like really Crawford is written out of it in terms of his chances of winning this fight. It's pretty much between a 60-40 or a 70-30 in this for Canelo's favor. And obviously I would say that probably pretty equal skill levels in addition to Canelo's weight here really is what puts that in his favor. But I would also say that something that maybe is going a little bit more underlooked for this fight is you have Crawford being a little bit taller than Canelo. On paper he's about a half an inch, but I would say just looking at the two of them when they faced off, it looked like Crawford had about an inch over Canelo, so it's really hard to say where exactly they're at. But another thing I would think that is a little bit unnoticed here is you have Crawford being a pretty clear favorite in terms of his reach advantage, about 4 inches. You have Canelo at 70.5 and Crawford at 74. So even though Canelo has the broader frame, I wouldn't say Crawford is necessarily the smaller guy by every margin, and definitely has some attributes in his favor, in addition to being a southpaw, which is also something that could give Canelo trouble. But also just looking at their characteristics, I would say you have to really give Canelo the edge in terms of his chin, whether it's all of the Triple G fights or going up and down in weight. I don't really think we've ever seen Canelo that hurt in any of his fights. I would think if anything, he's just gotten a little bit more frustrated, such as with the Mayweather or Bivol loss. But Crawford, on the other hand, I would say a few times has gotten wobbled or shown signs of hurt a little bit more, which is also a concern given in the weight difference. And even though Crawford has really shown a lot of precision and power and knockouts throughout a lot of his fights, I think it's a lot harder for him to really punch up in a way to hurt Canelo. But if we're looking at other things, you likely would have to give the speed and timing to Terence Crawford just by a thin margin. Though I would also say that there have been instances where fighters put on weight to go up and fight someone, and this can really kind of slow them down if they're not used to it. So that can definitely be a factor here as well. But both guys definitely can fight well all throughout all 12 rounds with great endurance. So I definitely think that adds to the chances of this being a really engaging bout. And I really think the concerns for Crawford are pretty present here just in terms of that weight issue. And obviously size and weight classes does matter in boxing, and we've seen that time and time again. But I don't know if as many concerns are being made for Canelo in this. I would say looking at his recent fight with Skrull, even though Canelo won in dominant fashion and it was pretty much a slow fight, I would say compared to where I've seen Canelo in recent fights, such as the Munguia fight, even though I would probably say there were some instances where he carried Munguia in that, and maybe that really wasn't a good fight in terms of really challenging Canelo to push him forward. I would still say he looked extremely sharp and just as good as ever, but I don't really think we saw that same Canelo in the Skrull fight. You do have Canelo really mentioning fighting outside of North America or outside of Mexico or the US for the first time, with this Saudi Arabia fight really kind of fatiguing him and it being a different experience for him, which is why he kind of felt flat in there. But I don't really know if this is the full story. I would also say that Canelo just didn't look in as good of condition as where we've seen him in recent fights. Not that he necessarily looked out of shape, but I do think that there was a noticeable difference there. And obviously Canelo's condition would be a symptom all throughout his fight camp, not just something that would really kind of happen right before the fight, such as the traveling to Saudi Arabia and kind of getting acclimated there. So I would think if that is the case and it wasn't necessarily just the Saudi Arabia factor and somehow that Canelo is past his prime or just not as sharp as he's been in the past, then maybe he's not fully coming into this Terence Crawford fight at 100%. I easily could see Crawford, despite the weight differences here, really kind of coming in and stealing a decision victory over Canelo. But I think we have seen for certain fighters in the past that you maybe do have dips in some of their mandatory or not as big name fights to really just keep them active, whereas they really kind of show up and train even more for a big fight. So I think it's definitely possible that Canelo comes in well prepared and in excellent shape for the Crawford fight, but it's really just hard to know if that's the last instance that we saw of him. And a lot of times in boxing or combat sports, you really do have to go off of those recent performances and kind of look past even what they've done in the past few years. And I would say just looking at the last fight we got of Crawford and the last fight that we got of Canelo, despite the weight differences, if those two versions of them fought, I would have Crawford beating Canelo by a split or unanimous decision. So I would say that this fight is a lot more closer to 50-50 despite what the odds say. And that's really kind of just the beginning of my prediction, even though I could still see Crawford winning in dominant fashion, whether it's a decision or he's somehow really able to fluster and stop Canelo, or I could also see Canelo's weight really wearing on Crawford and him scoring a late round knockout. But even if you do have a knockout one way or another, I would say the fight up to that point is obviously going to be pretty close in this. And in terms of just their two overall styles, I don't really think you have any holes in either of their games. Probably the only crucial contrast here is that Canelo just has a lot more weapons in terms of his big left hook, his body shots, and his right hand. So he really has a lot more to worry Crawford with and vice versa. And in that last Crawford fight, we did see him being a little bit more susceptible to those left hooks. So if he's in there with Canelo, that could obviously be a problem. And if Crawford has been wobbled by guys lesser in weight or ability than Canelo, that's definitely really a cause of concern here. But pretty good counter punching from both of them. We have seen Canelo get into that a little bit more in recent years. And even though Crawford probably has the edge in terms of a lot of those skills like speed, timing, and even countering, you really have Canelo also being pretty elusive in terms of his head movement. And in terms of really kind of comparing the two, even though fighter math or using one fighter as a measurement between two guys doesn't always equally add up, you do have Amir Khan, who has faced both Canelo and Crawford, and you have him getting knocked out by both of them. But in terms of both of those instances, I don't really think you have a clear favorite one way or another. You have Canelo landing a pretty devastating straight right hand against Khan that pretty much put him out, and then you have Crawford being pretty dominant the whole fight, but landing a body shot to really stop Khan. But besides the two knockouts, you do have a little bit of trouble that Canelo got himself in early in terms of not necessarily being hurt, but getting outboxed there. But I would say his pretty devastating finish to that fight makes up for it here. But besides that, I don't think either of these fighters have really faced the same caliber of opponent. I don't think Crawford has really faced anyone as skilled or as big as Canelo in terms of weight. And for Canelo, I don't know if he's really faced someone as skilled as Crawford in recent years. I would say the closest thing, of course, would be that Bivol loss, but I wouldn't say it was just necessarily Bivol's technique in that, but also his size and all aspects really helped Bivol, even though he is an excellent fighter. But you do have Crawford being described as having just such a pretty diverse array of skills in terms of his boxing abilities. Even for something as simple as clinches, he has somewhat of a wrestling background, which really can help in terms of those more physical clashes in fights. But of course, the original Mayweather fight, I think, is probably one of the closer examples to what this could look like. But I don't really think you've had a test like that for Canelo in terms of just skill alone really since then. I don't really think you have anything else that stands out one way or another. Both guys relatively the same age, even though Canelo would be a little bit younger here, but I don't think Crawford at 37 going on 38 is necessarily a concern in terms of age itself. And he's also stated publicly that he doesn't drink or smoke, which has really added to the longevity of his career. I would have to say you have to applaud Canelo for being the more active fighter, but I don't necessarily think that's a clear advantage here either, as Crawford seems like he is constantly training. But if I had to make my best bet, even though I could see a knockout happening, I probably would lean on a decision of some sorts. And unless there's some pretty significant knockdowns one way or another, it might just be up to the judges in terms of who will make that split decision here. So I think if that's the case, and in my opinion this fight's a little bit closer to 50-50, I do see it being very likely that Crawford does come out and is really able to surprise the narrative of this fight by really sticking with Canelo all throughout this. And I think if he is able to establish himself early and is really able to move around a lot in the ring and can really stay away from some of Canelo's bigger shots, I do think that there is a clear path to victory in terms of Crawford pulling out a decision. And I really think that his undefeated record is something to take into consideration here. So I really do like Crawford as the underdog. I probably would just have to lean in that direction, even though I wouldn't be super confident. But I can, again, see it kind of leaning in that favor just given their recent performances. So that's really the best way I could explain my prediction in the fight, even though I would probably just leave it as this being a closer fight than the odds would call for. But I'm interested to see how this will play out. So feel free to let me know your thoughts on this, and I'll see you later.